King Charles had entered the morning expecting a difficult legal hearing. What he did not expect was to hear his late former wife's name spoken beside a sealed archive that the palace believed had been fully accounted for decades earlier. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. Private letters written by Diana had remained outside royal custody, and Prince Harry had known where they were. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles felt the room tighten around him. The High Court, the senior court handling major civil disputes in England and Wales, had gathered to settle a fictional dispute over who should control private family papers connected to Diana, Princess of Wales. The king expected arguments over archive procedure, ownership, and access. William, following developments because the papers concerned their mother, expected the same. Neither man expected an accusation of concealment. The judge changed everything with one finding. In this dramatized account, Harry had retained a collection of Diana's private letters and failed to declare them after earlier requests for relevant correspondence to be transferred for archival review. Charles stopped writing. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the legal folder, and stared ahead without speaking. That silence carried more weight than fury. The king understood the dispute was no longer about paper. It was about whether one son had deliberately kept part of a mother's memory from her family. William absorbed the news differently. The prince learned that several letters came from the final years of Diana's life, and his composure hardened. He did not raise his voice. He simply asked, through a documented legal exchange in the fictional case, whether any correspondence had been addressed to him. The question exposed the deepest wound. Harry had not merely protected material from an institution. He may have decided what his brother was allowed to know. Then court counsel produced the detail that silenced the case. One handwritten envelope carried Diana's personal notation and a date from months before her death. Yet no palace catalog showed it had entered the archive. A separate chain of fictional correspondence showed Harry had acknowledged holding private material years earlier while resisting full transfer. Suddenly, the hidden collection had a history, a decision, and a person responsible for keeping it outside official custody. And the most dangerous question remained unanswered. Why? Charles could absorb the existence of the letters, but before he could decide whether to condemn Harry, he first had to confront something even more painful: the very different meanings Diana still carried for her husband and her two sons. The courtroom revelation was about hidden letters, but the deeper conflict had begun long before any judge opened a file. Diana had occupied a different emotional place in each man's life. To Charles, she represented a painful chapter never fully separated from the crown. To William, she remained a mother whose memory required protection. To Harry, she had become something even more personal, a legacy he believed only he could truly defend. Charles carried that history with restraint, learned over decades. In this dramatized account, the crown, the institution of the monarchy rather than simply the person wearing it, had forced him to separate pain from public duty, and he had spent years trying to honor Diana's place without allowing the past to rule the present. Now her private words threatened to reopen everything. For the king, the danger was not scandal alone. It was the return of grief in a form he could neither manage nor predict. William reacted with quieter force. The prince had learned to protect memory through order, duty, and preservation, while Harry had come to see palace control as something Diana herself had struggled against. That difference mattered because the letters were no longer just papers. They had become proof of two opposing ideas of loyalty. One brother believed protection meant preserving access fairly. The other believed protection meant keeping certain words beyond institutional reach. William sat alone after the hearing, with the court summary in front of him. He reached the line, confirming that Harry had withheld material, read it twice, then closed the folder. Anger came first, but sadness followed faster. His brother had shared the same loss, the same funeral, the same absence. Yet somehow, Harry had decided that part of their mother's voice could be guarded without William even knowing it existed. Harry saw the matter differently. though that did not erase the damage. In a fictional documented account of his private reasoning, he feared that once Diana's correspondence entered official custody, her words would become categorized, controlled, and stripped of the emotional context in which she wrote them. He believed he was protecting a mother from becoming an archive entry, but the inventory complicated that defense. Several envelopes were not addressed to him at all. Then William's name appeared again and again. Lawyers identified multiple references to him across the recovered correspondence, and the future king felt the betrayal sharpen. If Diana had written about him, or perhaps even to him, why had Harry kept those words hidden? The answer did not begin in court. It began years earlier, in one confrontation when a request for Diana's papers became a test of loyalty neither brother would ever forget. Years before a judge exposed the secret, there had been one private meeting that changed everything. No cameras recorded it. No public statement followed it. Yet inside the dramatized story, that evening became the point of no return. William wanted family papers consolidated for preservation. Harry believed surrendering them meant surrendering control over Diana's voice. When the request was made directly, the answer was not merely no, it was defiance. William arrived determined to keep the conversation controlled. The fictional archive project had been created to catalog Diana's personal material under agreed family restrictions, meaning letters, photographs, and private correspondence would be preserved together while access remained limited. For the prince, that mattered, because scattered papers could be lost, disputed, or used selectively. Harry saw the same plan as something more dangerous. To him, centralized custody risked turning private grief into palace property. Harry had already gathered several boxes from personal storage and trusted intermediaries. He had identified folders, photographs, and handwritten notes, but even William did not know the full contents. During the private meeting at Kensington Palace, the future king asked his brother to transfer every remaining letter into the joint family archive. Harry closed the storage list, pushed it back across the table, and refused until he knew exactly who would control access. The gesture was calm, the meaning was not. William felt the refusal cut deeper than procedure. He told Harry that their mother's correspondence belonged to their shared history, not to one son's private judgment. The younger brother heard something else entirely. He believed palace authority was once again being placed above personal grief, and his anger hardened. Neither man shouted, but the bitterness was unmistakable, because both believed they were defending Diana, while each saw the other as endangering her memory. Harry left that meeting having disclosed several folders, yet one smaller locked container remained unmentioned. Inside the dramatized account, it held handwritten letters from Diana. A palace aide later recorded the disagreement in a private administrative note, documenting that Harry had stated his disclosure was complete. That single sentence would eventually become devastating, because the newly recovered inventory proved otherwise. Charles read that old note only after the court connected it to the concealed collection. The king no longer saw a misunderstanding or an argument over storage. He saw a deliberate choice made years earlier, one that had divided his sons long before anyone outside the family understood why. For Charles, that distinction transformed disappointment into a far more personal wound, and now the quiet argument behind closed doors was returning with the force of a judgment, because Charles wanted the one explanation Harry had avoided giving for years. There are confrontations in royal life that happen through statements, secretaries, and carefully chosen phrases. This was not one of them. In the dramatized confrontation following the hearing, Charles wanted no aide speaking for him, and no lawyer softening the question. Harry entered expecting anger. What he encountered was worse. A father who looked exhausted, pushed the legal papers aside, and asked why Diana's sons had been kept apart by Diana's own words. Charles had called the meeting because the court disclosure had crossed a line no legal advisor could explain for him. The palace response, meaning the official action taken by the monarch and his household, could wait. First, the king wanted a father's answer. He excluded William deliberately, knowing that bringing both brothers into the room too soon would turn explanation into accusation. Harry understood immediately that there would be nowhere to hide behind formal language. Charles placed the court inventory between them. The inventory, a formal list identifying the recovered letters and their intended recipients, had become the most dangerous document in the dispute. He asked why the correspondence had never been declared. Harry answered through the private recorded conversation in this dramatized account that he feared Diana's voice would be controlled by the same institution she had once resisted. The king's expression hardened because the accusation was not aimed at an abstract system alone. It reached him too. Harry did not retreat. He argued that royal custody and family custody were not the same thing, and that placing Diana's private words under palace control could strip away the context in which she had written them. Charles listened, but his patience thinned. He told his son that protecting a mother's memory could never justify denying William access to words that might belong emotionally, and perhaps directly, to him. Then Harry admitted what the court had only implied. He had chosen to keep the letters separate. It had not been a mistake, an overlooked box, or a misunderstanding over paperwork. He insisted his motive was protection, but the admission destroyed the final possibility of innocence. Charles reached for one page and changed the entire conversation. The sealed inventory identified at least one letter written specifically for William. Harry stopped defending himself. For the first time, the younger son understood that the dispute was no longer about resisting palace control. It was about withholding something from his own brother. Charles made the next decision quietly. William would hear the truth directly from Harry, without lawyers or advisors between them. The court had exposed the concealment, but only William could decide whether it was forgivable. And behind that choice stood an even larger battle over who had the right to control Diana's private legacy. Once Harry admitted the concealment was deliberate, the question changed. The issue was no longer simply where the letters had been stored. It became a battle over authority. Could one son decide what happened to Diana's private words? Could the crown claim custody over material created outside official duty? And could William separate his responsibilities as heir from his pain as a son when one sealed envelope carried his own name? Charles understood that royal authority would not solve this cleanly. The crown, meaning the monarchy as a legal and constitutional institution, could not simply take possession of every private paper connected to Diana. The fictional court had to separate personal correspondence from material controlled by estate arrangements and from documents already covered by archival agreements. That distinction mattered because each category carried different rights, and Harry's concealment had blurred boundaries that were supposed to remain clear. William faced those boundaries with painful restraint. The prince entered the secure archive room where the recovered collection had been prepared for review and immediately saw the envelope marked for him. He did not touch it. He did not ask anyone to open it. Instead, the future king insisted that legal custody be settled first, because reading the letter too soon could make his personal grief appear to override the very rules he was expected to defend. Charles watched his son struggle and understood the cruelty of that position. The king saw an heir trying to behave with discipline, while a grieving child inside him wanted answers immediately. William had spent years believing that everything his mother intended him to have had either reached him or been properly preserved. Now one sealed envelope suggested otherwise, and Harry's decision had forced him to question how much had been kept beyond his reach. Then the court imposed its first direct consequence. In this dramatized ruling, the judge ordered that letters clearly intended for named recipients could not remain under Harry's exclusive control. Protected transfer meant those items would be moved under legal safeguards, with privacy preserved while possession changed. The decision was narrow, but emotionally it was enormous. Harry lost control of the envelope carrying William's name. He had argued that secrecy protected Diana, yet the court had concluded that protection did not give him the right to control another person's correspondence. For the younger son, the ruling turned an abstract legal dispute into a personal loss of authority. Charles received the decision, knowing the next choice belonged to him. The judgment had settled who could hold the letter, but it had not settled what Harry's secrecy had done to the family, and the first consequence beyond the courtroom was already approaching. Royal punishments do not always arrive with trumpets or declarations. Sometimes they arrive as a cancelled meeting, a withdrawn invitation, or a door that no longer opens. After the court's decision, Harry expected anger. What struck him harder was distance. The dramatized palace response was deliberately restrained, but its meaning was unmistakable. Until the private letter dispute was resolved, trust would no longer be assumed, simply because he was the king's son. Charles gave the instruction without ceremony. The king told his advisors that Harry would no longer take part in decisions involving Diana's archival material, meaning the private letters and papers preserved under controlled family access. He framed it as a safeguard, not a public humiliation. That distinction mattered because the monarch was not stripping away identity or family connection. He was removing authority from the exact area where trust had been broken. Harry received the written restriction alone. He read past the formal language until he reached the paragraph excluding him from future archival decisions, then lowered the page and sat without speaking. For years, he had convinced himself that control meant protection. Now that same instinct had cost him control entirely. The irony landed hard. He had tried to guard his mother's words and ended up losing the right to decide what happened to them. Charles felt no victory when confirmation arrived. The king told an advisor, in a fictional documented palace account, that punishment could establish boundaries but could not repair what had fractured between his sons. He understood the deeper danger. William and Harry were not divided by politics alone anymore. Their mother's memory had become part of the wound. William faced a different consequence. Under court-approved conditions, the prince was finally allowed to review correspondence specifically intended for him, without wider publication or palace circulation. He held the sealed envelope for several seconds before breaking it open. Then he began to read, and the anger that had carried him through the legal fight slowly gave way to grief. Diana's words contained no political weapon, no hidden command, no explosive attack on the monarchy. In this dramatized letter, she urged her sons to protect one another when pressure, duty, and resentment threatened to pull them apart. William read the passage again, and suddenly, Harry's concealment became even more painful. The letter his brother had hidden was asking them not to become strangers. William now faced a choice no court could make for him. He could treat the letter as final proof of betrayal, or he could allow his mother's words to change what came next. For the first time since the courtroom revelation, the most powerful document in the story was no longer the judgment. It was a mother's private message, asking two divided sons not to lose each other. William could have sent a message through lawyers. He could have allowed the palace restrictions to stand as his answer. Instead, the dramatized story turns on a far quieter decision. He takes Diana's letter with him and meets Harry privately. No aides sit between them. No court official records their words. For the first time, the brothers must confront not who controlled their mother's memory, but what she had asked them to become. William made the decision after reading the letter twice. The prince requested a private meeting with Harry, away from the formal court process, meaning outside the legal procedure that had governed every step since the hidden correspondence surfaced. Charles had expected greater distance between his sons, so the king was surprised when William chose contact instead. Yet he understood why. Some wounds could not be settled through judgments, advisors, or written statements. William arrived carrying only the folded letter. He told Harry immediately that Diana's words would remain private and would never be released for public argument. That choice mattered because their mother's message had emotional value precisely because it belonged to her sons, not to headlines. Then the future king placed the letter on the table and said that keeping it from him had hurt more than anything written inside it. Harry did not interrupt. Harry finally stopped defending the decision. In the private conversation described within this fictional account, he admitted that fear had made him confuse protection with ownership. He told William he had convinced himself that guarding Diana's papers meant guarding Diana herself, and that surrendering them felt like losing control of her memory all over again. The apology came without conditions, excuses, or another attack on the palace. William answered with the one truth neither brother expected to hear. Their mother had urged them not to let royal pressure, duty, resentment, or distance turn them into strangers. The irony landed immediately. The very letter Harry had hidden had carried a warning against the separation his secrecy helped deepen. Harry made his next choice without being ordered. He agreed to transfer every remaining undisclosed letter for independent cataloging under privacy protections, meaning the material would be recorded and preserved without becoming public property. That decision removed the threat of another legal fight and, for the first time, returned a measure of trust. William accepted the apology, but he refused to pretend the damage had disappeared. Reconciliation, he made clear, was not the same as forgetting. The brothers had finally reached the understanding their mother wanted. But outside that private room, the court revelation had already become a national story, impossible for the palace to contain, or easily reverse. By sunrise, the dispute no longer belonged only to Charles, William, and Harry. Diana's name dominated the national conversation once again, carrying the same strange mixture of affection, grief, and fascination that had followed her for decades. Yet the most powerful detail was not the existence of secret letters. It was the revelation that one of those letters had asked her sons to remain united, and had surfaced only after their relationship nearly broke apart. Buckingham Palace moved quickly to contain the damage. In this dramatized account, the palace, the monarch's official household and administrative center, released a tightly controlled statement, confirming that the court's directions would be respected and Diana's private correspondence would remain sealed from public release. Charles approved the wording because the issue had become larger than legal custody. It now threatened to turn a mother's most personal words into ammunition for a national argument. The public debate changed almost immediately. At first, criticism centered on Harry and his decision to keep the letters outside official custody. Then the tone shifted. Commentators began asking whether private family memories should ever be used as leverage inside royal disputes. William felt that question deeply because he had just received words from his mother that were never meant for strangers. Charles read the morning papers in silence. The king ignored the harshest headlines about Harry and stopped instead at an old photograph of Diana standing beside their sons as children. He folded the paper and set it down. For him, the image stripped away every court filing and palace statement. This was still, at its core, a family that had failed to protect itself from grief. Harry watched the story escape his control. He had believed secrecy would protect Diana, yet his secrecy had become the reason her letters now dominated the country. Outside Kensington Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates carrying flowers and photographs. One fictional front page captured the mood in 5 words. A mother's words, a family divided. Beneath it appeared William and Harry walking together years earlier. William refused to let that image become another weapon. Together with Charles, the prince rejected calls to publish the correspondence. The letters, they agreed, would remain private despite the public pressure. Harry had surrendered the collection, William had heard the apology, and the king had protected the boundary Diana never had the chance to defend herself. Trust had survived the first test, but forgiveness still demanded one final decision. Once the headlines faded, the monarchy was left with something no court could order, and no palace statement could manufacture. A final choice between preserving resentment and honoring the woman whose letters had caused the rupture. In the end, the most shocking part of the dramatized letter scandal was not that Harry had hidden Diana's correspondence. It was that the letters exposed the emotional cost of trying to control memory itself. Charles had been stunned by the concealment. William had felt robbed of something deeply personal. Harry had believed secrecy was protection. Yet once Diana's own message emerged, every man was forced to confront the same truth. Love cannot survive when remembrance becomes possession. Harry ended the legal fight by formally confirming that no additional undisclosed collections remained. The letters covered by the fictional ruling moved into independently supervised archival custody, meaning they would be preserved under neutral control rather than managed by one family member alone. Correspondence intended for specific recipients stayed private. That mattered because the dispute had never truly been about public curiosity. It had been about whether grief gave anyone the right to control another person's connection to Diana. Charles drew the final boundary with unusual restraint. The king rejected any retaliatory campaign against his son and refused to release private correspondence to improve the monarchy's image. He understood that using Diana's words as a weapon would repeat the very mistake that had caused the crisis. Harry, meanwhile, accepted that he would remain excluded from direct control over the archive. Trust, he now understood, would have to be rebuilt through actions rather than demanded through family status. William chose something harder than punishment. In a final private exchange, the prince told Harry that forgiveness did not erase what had happened, and reconciliation did not mean pretending the concealment was harmless. Still, he refused to let the hidden letters become another permanent wall between them. Harry accepted that judgment without argument. For once, neither brother tried to win. Diana's letter became the emotional verdict. It contained no secret command, no political conspiracy, and no explosive plan for the crown. Instead, her words carried a simpler warning. Pressure could separate her sons if they allowed pain to become identity. Charles finally understood that preserving her legacy meant allowing Diana to remain both a historic figure and a private mother, not a symbol claimed by competing sides. The monarchy emerged shaken, but clearer. Private grief could never again be treated as institutional property or ammunition by anyone. And so the letters that first stunned a king ultimately delivered a verdict no courtroom could write. Diana's memory belonged neither to Harry, nor William, nor the crown alone. It survived most honorably when none of them tried to possess it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.